My name is Tech64, also Chris. I am the assistant marketing and business team lead for uh, Cornered Rat Software, which is a small independent gaming development company, which is owned by Planet Incorporated. Um, One of the things that we're doing here is that when we talk a lot about our game and a podcast that we regarding veterans and their stories. But we elected to do something a little bit outside the box. One of the things that we have been wanting to do one of my dreams has been is that we're going to obviously expand this into military history, into historical events. This is our very first foray into that arena, so to speak. So we are extremely excited and very honored that James Szpajcher is going to be with us this evening, and particularly that we're going to be talking about Allied strategic bombing in correlation with the secret document 98, and he's going to go in detail about that. This is really what his presentation is going to be about, and how that impacted the European theater of operations in offensive bombing results and strategic bombing in World War II, which is daylight precision bombing, nighttime bombing. We're going to be speaking extensively regarding the Royal Air Force Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Corps and their bombers as well. So it is a very personal story for Jim. And so we're going to be laying out some things here. And then we're going to kind of get into some technical information there. But I will tell you that Jim's presentation is so genuinely honest and it's so well researched that I think that you guys will find this very, very entertaining. So without further ado, let me introduce tonight's speaker, Jim Szpajcher, who is a member of the Society of Military History out of St. Paul, Alberta, Canada. He has a Bachelor's of Art in Military History from the American Military University, received in 2019, a Master's of Art in Military History from the University of Wolverhampton in 2021, and his recent works have been aircrew survival rates in Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force, an investigation into the question of bearable casualty rates from the 1st of February 1942 to the 19th of April 1944. He's currently researching the 91st Bomb Group load list to compile rosters of air crew and record of B-17s that flew from that bomb group. And Jim, I'll allow you to add anything else you would like to regarding your background or anything you would like to say, and then we can begin whenever you're ready, sir.
Well, thank you, Chris. So this is just a little bit of a basic, introduction to myself. As you can see, I'm not a spring chicken. I made a career in the oil patch and in drilling. I was a drilling supervisor for many years, and then in 2015, when the price of oil collapsed, I ended up finding myself out of work, and I hadn't finished a university degree. And I was interested in history, and I had always been interested in military history. So if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is I took a number of trips with my wife to Belgium and France. And when you go to the battlefields of the First World War, you find that it's just staggering the number of cemeteries. This is a picture from behind the front lines of what would have been the British German lines in 1916 on the Somme, in the Somme River Valley. And in this photograph, you're looking at three different cemeteries. There's one in the foreground, which is British. Then there's one in the mid background, which is French, and then in the far distance, there's another British one. And the guidebook for that the British Commonwealth War Graves Commission puts out lists cemeteries for both World War I and World War II. but they have something like 940 cemeteries that cover that area, and the vast majority of them are from the First World War. So when you're touring these battlefields, you start to become very, very affected by just the sheer number of casualties. So when you start comparing the First World War casualty rates with the Second World War casualty rates, because you're touring both World War I and World War II cemeteries, what you find is that the casualty rates were a lot lower in the Second World War, and there's a number of reasons for that. But it seemed like the armies were very cognizant about trying to avoid heavy casualties like they had suffered in the First World War. So when I started looking into the bombing campaign and started looking at the casualty rates that the bombers had, both in the 8th Air Force and in Bomber Command with the Royal Air Force, I was flabbergasted to find out that the casualty rates were on the level of the infantry of the First World War. So I started poking around, and I couldn't find any place to verify a lot of these numbers. So I've got a personal interest in this. If you go to the next slide, this is my wife's youngest uncle, who was killed as a tail gunner on a Halifax bomber with one of the RAF squadrons. He was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, but he was killed with 158 Squadron. This is his headstone at Brookwood Cemetery and just outside of London. And he was killed on the night of June 8th, 1944, 2 days after D-Day, when the bomber squadron that he was with were bombing the rail yards in Versailles to stop the Germans from bringing armor up to the beaches, the invasion beaches, which had just happened. So if I've got a personal connection to this. But then I started looking at RAF information is very difficult and challenging to come across. And in the meantime, I had become acquainted with some of the 8th Air Force stuff, including the 91st Bomb Group. So if you go to the next slide, Chris, I happen to have a print that's autographed by Robert Morgan, and he was the man who was the pilot in the Memphis Belle. And for all of those who are familiar with that Memphis Belle documentary / film story that William Wyler did, Robert Morgan was the pilot. So he wrote a book that came out in the early 2000s, but I had an autographed print that was done by an artist by the name of Robert Taylor, and he had Robert Morgan sign this. So I started looking into information about the 91st Bomb Group, and for no other reason that I had this connection. There was lots of American heavy bomber groups, there was lots of B-17 groups, lots of B-24 groups, but because I had this connection with Robert Morgan, I decided to start looking into it, and I found that there was a real lack of any sort of statistical study for casualties and for operations. There's lots written about it. There's lots of personal anecdotes, but to try and find out what really happened on a statistical level is very, very difficult. So if you could go to the next slide, Chris. So along the way, I ended up purchasing the official history, and I believe you can even download these at no charge right now. But I bought the hardcover set, 7-volume set of the Army Air Forces in World War II, and I started looking through there, and I found that they've got thousands of pages in this massive 7-volume set. But nowhere do they discuss casualties. Nowhere do they discuss aircraft losses. There's the odd comment in there about the fact that the 15th Air Force was one of the reasons for developing it was to try and take the pressure off the 8th Air Force. But there's no data, there's no tables, there's no nothing. And so I started looking to see where I could find out, and I found out that there's no real official numbers. Everything that's been developed over the last 70, 80 years has been done by amateur historians memorial groups, and academics that have done individual research on there. So could you go to the next slide, Chris, please? So the Army Air Forces had a statistical digest, and when you look up that, you can download this for free. And when you look into it, they have a breakdown of how many gallons of gasoline they used, how many bullets they fired, how many bombs of different weights they dropped, how many aircraft were assigned, how many aircraft were lost. But when you look to try and find out information about casualties, they lump them all together. They don't have any breakdown for what the Bomber Command, the 8th Bomber Command casualties were and what their specific losses are. They lump them in with the 9th Air Force. So they divided up by theater of operations. So you have the European theater of operations casualties, and you have the Mediterranean theater of operations casualties. And there was a Air Force historian by the name of Richard Davis that commented on the fact that like, this is really odd, because you can document virtually every bomb that was dropped, but you can't find out how many men served, and you can't find out how many men became casualties in the heavy bombers. And when you don't have that, you don't know what the survival rate was. So could you move to the next slide, please? So one of the things that shows up when you're looking at all of this is that there was a mass in the training campaigns that the Army Air Forces had. They had massive numbers of casualties. So before anybody could even get into combat, they had to survive the training system in there. This is a series by Morales, and it's a 3-volume set, and it documents there's something like 7,200 fatal accidents involving 15,000 men, and these are men that were killed while in the continental United States. Most of them were in training. So I mean, that's an incredible number of men to lose.
That's huge.
Yeah, it was just one of those things, and so this gives you an idea about the fact that, like, wait a minute, what were they doing to try and maximize the employment of these highly trained men using very expensive equipment? And this becomes kind of what the whole source of my quest for information. So could you go to the next slide, please? So in the 8th Air Force, they in the Statistical Digest, they don't break down between B-17s and B-24s. They call them heavy bombers, and they report that in the European theater, they lost 6,592 B-17s and B-24s. Well, the 8th Air Force was the only one that was operating these aircraft for for operational purposes. So I went and looked through. There's a series put out by a British fellow by the name of Stan Bishop, and he's had various co-authors with him. And he's been putting out a series of volumes. He's up to 6 now, and he's up to the end of March 31st, 1945. So when you go through his numbers at the end of his volume 6, we find out that they lost 4,192 B-17s and 2,195 B-24s. The number of men that served, we don't know. There's no official casualty figures. There's all kinds of amateur stuff, but we don't have any official numbers for what they had. But you can see, if on average, if 10 men per aircraft are flying, we're looking at 63,000 men, and that's a lot of men for an Air Force that, the whole idea is that, bombing was supposed to be, something that would win the war quickly and easily, and they always talked about acceptable losses.
Well, I don't even think the American public is even aware. I mean, seriously, I mean, the average, even amateur historian, I mean, you know what I'm saying, in terms of like, hey, I like myself, these numbers are significant. This is not what the picture that is painted.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, like 6,500 heavy bombers. Like, holy smokeroonies! Everybody's seen the pictures about what is it, Kingman in Arizona, when they brought the bombers back
Yes.
and chopped them up for scrap and that. Well, I mean, those were the ones that were left over. Look at the losses that were happening, over, and this is just one Air Force. This is just the 8th Air Force. You also had the 15th Air Force, and you had the 20th and 21st Bomber Commands with the B-29. So, I mean, this was a serious effort. So then the question is what do we know from all of that? And so this is one of the things that drives me. So if you go to the next slide. So one of the things that I found out when I was looking through all of this is the fact that the B-17 could sustain more damage than the B-24. And Palmer, who was a medical doctor who was involved in doing studies on casualties from flak, and he wrote 2 chapters in a book that you could download. It's not online actively right now, but I've got the what are they called, the Wayback Machine, from the Internet Archive, the
Hmm.
link to it. But he said there it has been learned unofficially that the more difficult and heavily defended enemy targets were attacked by B-17s, and that the targets of lesser importance were usually attacked by B-24s. And that so what happened was is that this meant that the B-17s had to fly higher because they were going over these dangerous targets. And he said approximately 70% of the casualties due to flak in B-17s were wounded at an altitude of 24,000 feet or above, whereas 92% in the B-24s were wounded at 23,000 feet or below. So when we start looking at the various types, we know that in the Pacific, by and large, the 20th and 21st bomber campaigns were basically B-29s, with what they called the very heavy bombers. In the Mediterranean, we saw a lot of the B-24s, but for the heavy work that was going on in the intense combat that we were looking out of England, they had a lot of B-24s, groups that came on in late 1943 and into 44, but it was by and large a B-17 war. And the primary reason for this was the fact that it could just take the punishment. But the problem is that when it can take the punishment, that meant that the flak casualties were going to be higher. So if you give me the next slide on it there. So, people talk about, I don't know, there was a couple of years back, there was a bunch some people that remastered the film that Weiler had shot, and they brought in some old veterans that were still with us, and they talked about, they made like an hour and a half documentary called The Cold Blue. I don't know how many people have watched that,
Right.
but they talk about the casualty rates, and as at one point in the early part of it, they said in 1943 the chances of coming back were less than 25%. So when you sit there and you look at a 25 mission tour, and you figure, well, what does that mean? So if you've got a 1% loss rate over 25 missions, that means 77 percent are going to survive their combat tour. If you and you can see the survival rate for 2%, 3%, 4%. I the numbers for the last August, September, and October for the 91st bomb group that I've been doing research on it there, their loss rate in those 3 months during the heavy fighting. This is the first and second Schweinfurt missions, the Munster mission, the Stuttgart mission, the Anklam mission, and all that sort of stuff. That were they were going into Germany, and they didn't have the long range escort fighters taking them all the way into the target. So the 91st Bomb Group from August through October of 1943, their loss rate was over 11%. So their aircrew had a 5% chance of surviving.
Literally off
And
the chart.
yeah, like
Mhm.
no, the thing about it is that they after the second Schweinfurt mission, they changed the way they conducted their bombing, and they never stopped bombing. Lots of people think that that well, after Schweinfurt they didn't do anything until Big Week in February, but they did bomb, but they weren't going deep into Germany until they could bring the P-51s and the long range P-47s and stuff like that. But the thing about it is that you know uh, what is it that they were trying to do that would cause them to take these kind of losses? And that was the question that interested me, is like when you've got double digit loss rates on there, you know on any given mission with a 10% loss rate, you got a 90% chance of coming back, but you can't do that 25 times. And so this is the sort of thing that got me interested in it. So if you go to the next slide, this is a copy of a document that a group surgeon for the 306 bomb group, and you can't read it, and I apologize for that, but there was a fellow by the name of Thurman Schuler who got very alarmed at the fact that his the officers and men that he was in charge of, medically, were disappearing at a rate that nobody expected. So in March of 1943, he finally wrote a letter to the group surgeon for the 8th Air Force, and he said, we have to do something, because up to that point in time, there was no defined operational tour for length for a combat tour, and it was Thurman Schuler and some other people that started raising questions about the fact that after 22 missions, 22 and a half missions, nobody was going to be left. That they finally brought in this 25 mission tour, and in the fall of and over the winter of 1942-43, there wasn't a limit. They expected that they would win the war with strategic bombing, and they didn't really have this well thought out. And this was a great big experiment. Now, the one thing to be said about the way the 8th Air Force conducted operations, and the way General Arnold in Washington and that was doing it, is that they only had a limited number of bomber groups, heavy bomber groups, that were conducting operations over the winter of 1942 and into 1943. So there was really only 4 B-17 groups that were flying, and there was a couple of B-24 groups, but they were spending a lot of time flying out of the Mediterranean, looking after the invasion of North Africa, and then getting ready to go into Sicily and Italy and stuff. So while the casualty rates were very high for these groups that were flying, there was only 4 groups that were doing this. It wasn't till May of 1943 that we started seeing new groups coming into the 8th Air Force, coming into theater and starting to beef up. But the early groups took quite a pounding, and then the groups that flew that started flying in the summer of 1943, they just took very horrendous losses, because everybody believed at that time that self-defending bomber formations would be able to go in and fly anywhere that they wanted, and it took a really hard experiment to try and find out what the truth of that was.
So
So
they
if you
really, I'm sorry, go ahead, sir.
no, go ahead.
So they were not prepared in terms of because they thought their premise was going to be correct. And
Yeah,
we look in paragraph 2 on this, of the original officers, 28.7 are remaining at this day with an average of 16.3 missions or raids each. And yet they're going to become extinct after an average of 22.6 missions. And then it's taking the physician at a squadron level to bring this attention to higher command.
yes, and like he was group level.
Okay.
So he was the group surgeon, but he sat there and he brought this up, and he said, well, wait a minute, like, what are we doing here? And so when I started doing my research on the 91st Bomb Group, I itemized the name of every man that flew on an airplane on a Excel spreadsheet, and then I tracked the missions that they flew as they went through, as the group flew mission after mission after mission. And it's quite a challenging work to do, and it takes a lot of time, but you find out some really interesting things. So there was 375 men that flew in the first month. So I call those the original crews. And with the 25 mission combat tour that came into effect, as they were finishing up their tours in the spring of 1943, because that's what the Memphis Belle thing was all about, was that, the first crew and the first airplane to do 25 missions. So by the time they were coming in there, you look at the median number of missions that were completed by these 375 men, and it works out to 9 missions. Half the men were only completing 9 missions. I mean, this is on a 25 mission tour, so you have to sit there and say, well, holy smokes, is this what we want to do with our highly trained men and with our expensive equipment? Like, what are we doing here?
Mm.
And so then there was this group of replacement crews that came in the spring of 1943, and just as there was more bomber groups that were coming in, and anyone who's familiar with Masters of the Air, you'll see that they talk about Bucky Egan and Buck Clevin. They started flying in June of 1943, and then they had this real tough series of missions up to the fall of 1943. Well, I haven't tracked the numbers in the 100th Bomb Group, but in the 91st Bomb Group, the crews that came in between the 1st of June 1943 and the end of August 1943, the median number of missions flown by those men, and it was about 400 men, the median number was 8 missions. So they had a rougher time than the original crews did over the winter of 42-43. Then there was another set of men started coming in September and October and November of 1943, and they were catching the hard missions in September and October, and the median number of missions completed by that group of men was 8 missions. And it wasn't until you look at the men that started coming in December and January December of 1943 and January of 1944 that you start seeing the survival rate go up again. The median number starts climbing up to 9 and 10 and 12, missions. But there was thousands of men that they did not have a chance at trying to survive their 25 mission tour.
B-17 in trouble out at 2 o'clock watching.
Got an engine on fire. There's 2 more diving through the 94th.
3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on them, boy.
Coming around to 10.
Watch them, Chuck. Keep your eyes open.
Yeah.
They're breaking at 11, breaking at 11.
I got him.
I got those 2 at 2 o'clock. Check SB-17, Chuck, 3 o'clock. Motor smoking. Fighters 10:30, coming around.
Those 10:30 upper or lower?
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock.
Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out.
There's one. He come out of the bomb bay.
Yeah, I see him.
There's a tail gunner coming out.
Watch out for fighters.
8 men still in that B-17.
Come on,
Get out of there.